The jungle night is absolute. It presses in, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. For 2 days, there has been no rest, only the rhythmic metallic chatter of a machine gun. One man, stripped to the waist, his skin slick with sweat and rain, becomes a part of the weapon. He clears a jam with burned hands, feeds it another belt of ammunition, and braces for the next wave. He is not just fighting, he is a human wall, a single point of defiance against an ocean of shadows moving through the kunai grass. What turns a man into such a force? What brings him to a place where giving up is not even a thought? To find an answer, you have to travel far from the Pacific to a small town in New Jersey. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Raritan, a place of brick storefronts and close-knit families. This is where John Basilone grew up, the 6th of 10 children in a bustling Italian-American household. His father was a tailor, a man who worked with his hands, instilling a quiet discipline. Life was not easy, but it was grounded in simple truths. You worked hard, you looked after your own, and you never showed weakness. It was a world away from the war that would later define him, a simple beginning for a man who would earn the nickname Manila John. But the quiet life of a small town was never going to hold him. There was a restlessness in John, a current that pulled him toward a bigger horizon. He left school at 15, not out of defiance, but out of a need to do something, to feel the weight of the world in his hands. He worked odd jobs, drove a truck, and built a reputation as a tough, reliable young man. He was not a brawler looking for trouble, but stories from that time suggest he was someone you did not cross. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed out of place for a boy who had barely finished middle school. It was the confidence of someone who knew his own strength, long before it was ever tested by an enemy. This search for purpose led him, almost inevitably, to the military. But his first enlistment was not with the Marines. In 1934, years before the world was on fire, he joined the United States Army. He was sent to the Philippines, a posting that was considered peaceful, almost idyllic. It was there he found a sense of belonging, a structure that channeled his energy. He became a champion boxer, honing the instincts that would later serve him so well. The Army gave him a taste of the world beyond New Jersey, but it was just a preview. After 3 years, his tour was up, and he came home, back to the same small town, the same quiet life. For a short while, it seemed he might settle down. He returned to driving a truck, the familiar routine. But how do you go back to a quiet road after you have seen the ocean? The world was changing. News from Europe and Asia grew darker by the day. The restlessness that had always been a part of him now had a focus. He knew where he belonged. He tried to re-enlist in the Army, but they would not guarantee he could return to the Philippines. So he looked elsewhere. He walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in Baltimore. He told them he wanted to fight. He could not have known then that he was walking toward a destiny that would make him a legend. The Marine Corps of 1940 was a different world from the Army he had known. It was smaller, harder, and built around a mystique of being the first to fight. It was a place for men who were not just serving, but who were looking for the ultimate test. For John, who had already proven his toughness in the boxing ring and on duty in the Philippines, this was not a step up. It was the only step that made sense. He was not a boy looking for adventure anymore. He was a man who had seen the world and now chose the hardest path he could find. Training at Paris Island was a furnace designed to burn away the individual and forge a weapon. Even for a veteran like Basilone, it was a shock. The army had discipline, but the Marine Corps had a kind of controlled fanaticism. The drill instructors were relentless, breaking men down to their essential parts and rebuilding them in the image of the Corps. But for John, this environment was a crucible he was uniquely prepared for. He did not break, he hardened. His prior service gave him an edge, a quiet confidence that the instructors likely noticed. He was not intimidated, he was focused. He gravitated toward the heavy weapons, specifically the Browning M1917 machine gun. It was a complex and unforgiving piece of equipment. It could overheat, it could jam, and it required a team to operate effectively. But in the right hands, it was the anchor of any defensive line, a tool of immense power. There was something in its mechanical certainty that must have appealed to him. It was a job that required strength, precision, and an almost intimate understanding of the machine. He did not just learn to fire it, he learned its language. His training continued at Quantico and New River, North Carolina. He was part of the 1st Marine Division, a unit being rapidly expanded and hardened for a war that everyone knew was coming. The question was not if, but where. He was promoted to corporal and then sergeant, his natural leadership and experience making him an obvious choice to command a machine gun section. He was no longer just a gunner. He was responsible for the lives of other men, young recruits who looked to him for answers he did not always have. The waiting ended with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The atmosphere in the barracks must have shifted overnight. The drills were no longer just practice. Every movement, every piece of training now had a deadly purpose. They were shipped out, first to Samoa, and then, in the summer of 1942, they were briefed on their real destination. A place most of them had never heard of, a remote island in the Solomon Chain covered in jungle and swamp, an island called Guadalcanal. The landing itself was deceptively simple. The initial resistance was light, but the island was its own enemy. The heat was a physical weight, the air thick with moisture, and the constant drone of insects. Malaria and dysentery would become as dangerous as any human foe. For the first few weeks, the battle was one of logistics and labor, unloading ships, digging foxholes, and setting up perimeters around a vital, half-finished airstrip that would be named Henderson Field. It was grueling, unglamorous work under the constant threat of air raids. The real fight began in the jungle, away from the relative safety of the beachhead. Patrols pushed into the green darkness and sometimes did not come back. The enemy was elusive, masters of camouflage and ambush. This was a different kind of war than anyone had trained for. It was personal, close, and terrifying. The nights were the worst. The jungle came alive with strange sounds, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Sleep was a luxury, and paranoia was a constant companion. For Sergeant Basilone and his machine gunners, their job was to create points of certainty in this chaos. They dug their emplacements deep, cleared fields of fire, and strung barbed wire. Their guns were the teeth of the defensive line. An early test came during the Battle of the Tenarue River. While not his most famous engagement, it was here that the Marines learned the terrifying nature of the Japanese banzai charge. Waves of men, screaming, running directly into the machine guns. It was a brutal lesson in what they were up to against, an enemy with a completely different understanding of life and death. This experience changed the men. It stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of the conflict. They saw what their weapons could do, and they saw the fanaticism they faced. Basilone's section performed well, but the battle left its mark. It reinforced the absolute necessity of keeping the guns running, no matter what. A jammed weapon, a moment of hesitation, could mean not just your death, but the death of everyone around you. The stakes were absolute. As the weeks on Guadalcanal turned into months, John's reputation began to grow. He was Manila John, the veteran who had been there before, the one who seemed unshakable. In a place defined by fear and uncertainty, his calm was a valuable commodity. He was a demanding leader, drilling his men relentlessly on clearing jams and changing barrels, knowing that muscle memory was all you could rely on when your mind was screaming in terror. He was not just their sergeant, he was their teacher of survival. He seemed to have an instinct for the gun. He could diagnose a problem by sound alone, his hands working in the dark to fix a stoppage that would have sent a less experienced gunner into a panic. He treated the Browning not as a tool, but as a living part of his team. He knew its temper, its needs. He insisted on keeping it immaculately clean, even when the men were exhausted and covered in mud. This obsession was not about military regulation, it was about life and death. His men might have grumbled, but they saw the purpose in his intensity. He also showed an understanding of tactics that went beyond his rank. He was known to survey the terrain, to think about where an attack was most likely to come from, and to position his guns for the best possible fields of fire. He was not just following orders, he was thinking like the enemy. This proactive approach, this refusal to be passive, set him apart. He was not just waiting for the fight to come to him, he was preparing for it in a way that gave his men a crucial edge. This growing respect was not just from the enlisted men. Officers began to take notice. In the small, isolated world of the Guadalcanal perimeter, a man's true character was impossible to hide. Basilone was proving himself to be more than just a tough soldier. He was a leader who inspired confidence. When he was on the line, the men around him felt safer. They knew that whatever happened, Manila John would be there, and his gun would be firing. The larger battle for the island was escalating. The fight for Henderson Field was becoming the focal point of the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese were pouring reinforcements onto the island, determined to push the Marines into the sea. The American perimeter was stretched thin, a fragile line holding back an overwhelming force. The men were exhausted, sick, and running low on everything from food to ammunition. They were holding on by a thread. In late October, intelligence reported a massive Japanese force, numbering in the thousands, moving through the jungle toward a southern sector of the perimeter. This sector was held by Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. And within that battalion were 2 sections of heavy machine guns commanded by Sergeant John Basilone. He was positioned on a low ridge overlooking a narrow, muddy trail, a natural funnel for any attacking force. The rain started in the afternoon, a cold, miserable downpour that turned the ground to muck. As darkness fell, the jungle in front of them went silent. It was an unnatural quiet, the kind that comes before a storm. The men in the foxholes waited, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. They knew the attack was coming. They just did not know when or how ferocious it would be. Basilone moved between his gun pits, checking on his men, offering a quiet word of encouragement. He made sure the ammunition was ready, the spare barrels were close at hand, and that everyone knew their job. He was the calm center of the storm that was about to break. His experience told him this would be unlike anything they had faced before. This was not a patrol or a skirmish. This was a battle for survival, the fate of Henderson Field, and perhaps the entire campaign, could very well rest on this thin line of tired men and on the steady rhythm of their machine guns. Then the night exploded. Green flares shot into the sky, casting a ghostly, wavering light over the landscape. From the darkness of the jungle came a sound, a low rumble that grew into a roar of thousands of voices. A human wave, bayonets fixed, surged up the narrow trail directly toward Basilone's position. There was no tactic, no subtlety, just the sheer weight of numbers thrown against a thin line of defenders. The world shrank to the narrow field of fire in front of the guns. Basilone's guns opened up, a crossfire that tore into the first wave. The noise was deafening, a continuous, hammering rhythm that seemed to shake the very ground. He moved between his two crews, shouting orders over the din, directing their fire, keeping them focused. The attackers fell, but more kept coming, climbing over their own dead and wounded, driven by a relentless momentum. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and hot metal. Suddenly, a grenade arced through the dark and landed near one of his gun pits. The explosion was a dull crump, followed by a terrible silence from that side of the line. One of his guns was out of action, its crew wounded or worse. A hole had just been punched in their defenses, an opening the Japanese would pour through. In that moment of crisis, with no time to wait for orders, Basilone made a decision that defied all logic of self-preservation. He hoisted a spare 35-pound machine gun and began to drag it, along with its 40-pound tripod, across open ground raked by enemy fire. He wrestled the heavy steel into a new position, set it up, and got it firing just as another wave of attackers reached the ridge. He had single-handedly plugged the gap in the line. But this was only the beginning of his ordeal. The fight was just a few minutes old, and it was already threatening to overwhelm them. The guns were hungry. The rate of fire required to hold back the waves of attackers was unsustainable. Ammunition belts were being consumed at a terrifying pace. To make matters worse, the supply lines had been cut. The Japanese were not just attacking from the front. Their infiltrators had slipped around the flanks and were now behind the American lines, severing the path for resupply. The men were isolated, their ammunition dwindling with every burst they fired. Without hesitation, Basilone did the unthinkable. He simply left the relative safety of the gun pit and ran, a dark shape moving through a landscape of chaos. He fought his way through the jungle, through enemy soldiers who were now established behind the main line of defense. Armed with his pistol, he cleared a path to a supply point, gathered up heavy boxes of ammunition, and began the perilous journey back. It was a trip he would have to make again and again throughout the night. He returned to find his position on the verge of being overrun. He became the gunner, the loader, the commander, all at once. His hands were burned from changing the searing hot barrels, which glowed a dull red in the darkness. When the gun jammed, he cleared it with an instinct born of endless training. When the enemy got too close, breaking through the curtain of fire, he dropped the gun and used his .45 caliber pistol, fighting them off in brutal close-quarters combat. For nearly 48 hours, with almost no rest, no food, and no water, he held the line. The Japanese regiment, numbering some 3,000 men, threw themselves at his position in relentless waves. They were determined to break through this one point. And at this one point stood John Basilone, a man who seemed to be everywhere at once, a force of nature fueled by sheer will. He was no longer just a sergeant. He was the living embodiment of the Marine Corps' defiance. When the sun finally rose on the second day, the attacks subsided. The scale of the defense was laid bare. The ground in front of his position was a testament to the night's fury. He had held a critical piece of the perimeter, preventing a breakthrough that could have led to the collapse of the entire American position around Henderson Field. He was one of only a handful of men from his section to walk away. The story of what happened on that muddy ridge would soon travel far beyond the jungle of Guadalcanal, transforming a sergeant from New Jersey into a national hero. The Medal of Honor is not just an award, it is a transformation. For John Basilone, it meant he was no longer simply a Marine sergeant who had done his duty. He was now a symbol, an embodiment of American courage. But symbols do not belong on the front lines. They are too valuable to risk. And so, the very act that defined him as a warrior was the one that threatened to take the war away from him for good. His greatest moment of clarity in the jungle was about to lead him into a world of profound confusion. He was pulled from the Pacific Theater and sent home, back to a country that was fighting a different kind of war, a war of production, of morale, of selling an idea. After the mud and the fear of Guadalcanal, the United States must have seemed like another planet. Clean streets, cheering crowds, people who only knew the conflict through newsreels and headlines. He was greeted not as a soldier returning from hell, but as a celebrity stepping onto a red carpet. And the Marine Corps had a new mission for him, one that required a suit and a smile instead of a helmet and a machine gun. The War Bond Tour. It was a whirlwind of parades, factory speeches, and radio interviews. He was paraded across the country, a living, breathing advertisement for victory. His job was to tell his story, to inspire people to buy the bonds that would fund the very war he had just left. He was good at it. His natural charisma, his straightforward manner, it all connected with the public. But with every handshake, with every round of applause, a quiet crisis was building inside him. What could he really say to these people? How could he translate the screams in the dark, the smell of burnt cordite, the weight of a friend's body into a neat, inspiring anecdote? He felt a growing disconnect, a sense of being an imposter in his own life. He was being celebrated for an experience that had nearly destroyed him, an experience that was still being lived by thousands of other men he had left behind. The cheers of the crowd must have sounded hollow, a distant echo of the gunfire that still rang in his ears. This was his new battle, a fight against the suffocating comfort of safety. While he was being photographed with movie stars and sleeping in soft beds, his fellow Marines were island hopping across the Pacific, facing horrors he knew all too well. The guilt became a constant companion. He was a sergeant of Marines, a leader of men. His place was with them, not here, not on a stage. The hero's welcome had become a gilded cage, and he knew he had to break out. He began to petition the Marine Corps. He asked, then demanded, to be sent back to the fighting. At first, his requests were denied. He was too valuable as a public figure. He was a national asset, a face for the war effort. Losing him in combat would be a blow to morale, a risk the brass was unwilling to take. But Basilone was as stubborn in this fight as he had been on Guadalcanal. He was not asking for a favor. He was demanding the right to do his job. He turned down a commission as an officer. He turned down a comfortable instructor role in Washington. He made it clear that he would not rest until he was back with the fleet, heading for the front. His persistence was relentless. He was a problem the Marine Corps could not ignore. Finally, they relented, but with a condition. He would not be sent directly into a combat unit. He would first go to Camp Pendleton in California to train the new generation of Marines who were preparing to ship out. It was a world away from the war-bond tour, and for Basilone, it must have felt like coming home. He was back in his element, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of the Corps. He was a sergeant again, shaping raw recruits into fighting men. He poured all of his experience, all of his hard-won knowledge into them. He was preparing them for the very inferno he was so desperate to return to. And it was here, in this place of preparation and impending departure, that his life took another unexpected turn. He met Lena May Riggy. She was not a starlet or a society girl. She was a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, a fellow non-commissioned officer who understood his world in a way no civilian ever could. She understood the language, the discipline, the unspoken code. She saw the man, not the hero on the poster. Their connection was immediate, grounded in a shared reality that few could comprehend. Their courtship was brief, lived under the ever-present shadow of the war. There was an urgency to their time together, a sense that every moment was precious. He was a man preparing to go to a place from which he might not return, and she was a woman who understood exactly what that meant. They found in each other a refuge, a small pocket of peace in a world defined by conflict. They married in the summer of 1944. For a short time, John Basilone was not just a hero or a sergeant. He was a husband. He had found something profound to live for, a future he could imagine beyond the next battle. He had a wife, a home, the respect of his men, and the admiration of his country. He had every reason in the world to accept the safe path that was offered to him, but the transports were loading. The men he had trained were preparing to face the Empire of Japan at its most desperate, and for a man like John Basilone, there was only one place to be. Not on a stage, not in a training camp, but at the front, leading his men. He had fought to get back to the war. Now, with more to lose than ever before, he was about to get his wish. The next island on the map was a volcanic rock called Iwo Jima. The island of Iwo Jima rose from the sea like a dark, misshapen tooth. Its beaches were not sand, but coarse, black volcanic ash, a landscape that seemed to have been scorched into existence. As the landing craft churned toward the shore on the morning of February 19, 1945, there was an unnatural silence. The massive naval bombardment that had pounded the island for days had ceased, and in the quiet that followed, the men could see the ominous shape of Mount Suribachi looming over them. For John Basilone, this was the moment he had fought for, a return to the only world that now made sense to him. He was surrounded by the young Marines he had trained, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. He was their gunnery sergeant, their living legend, the man who had been there before. The ramps dropped. The world tore apart. The silence was a lie, a carefully laid trap. From hundreds of hidden positions, from concrete pillboxes and fortified caves honeycombed throughout the island, the Japanese defenders opened fire. It was not a chaotic defense, but a coordinated, systematic storm of steel. Mortars, machine guns, and artillery raked the black beaches, turning the landing zone into a killing field. The volcanic ash, so soft and deep, became a nightmare. It bogged down vehicles, making them stationary targets. It exhausted the men, forcing them to crawl where they should have been running, pulling at their legs with every step. The carefully laid plans for a swift advance off the beach disintegrated in the first few minutes. The Marines of the 5th Division were pinned down. They were caught in a brutal crossfire, with no cover on the open beach. Ahead of them lay Motoyama Airfield No. 1, their first objective. But between them and the airfield was a network of interlocking defenses, a wall of enemy fire. Men sought whatever shelter they could find, hugging the black ash as shells exploded around them. The momentum of the entire invasion was grinding to a halt before it had even begun. In the chaos and the terror, units became fragmented, and leadership was a matter of who was still standing. What could one man do in the face of such overwhelming, calculated resistance? For John Basilone, there was no hesitation. This was Guadalcanal all over again, but compressed into a few hundred yards of volcanic wasteland. He saw his young Marines frozen, trapped by the sheer volume of fire. He knew that to stay put was to perish. He got to his feet and began to move, not with reckless abandon, but with a clear, tactical purpose. He ran from one crater to the next, shouting encouragement, directing the fire of his machine gun crews, physically pulling men up and pushing them forward. He became the focal point in the chaos, a singular point of will that refused to be broken. He was no longer just a sergeant. He was the engine of the advance. His target was a formidable concrete blockhouse on the edge of the airfield, a position that was pouring devastating fire onto the beach. It had to be silenced. Leading a small group of men, Basilone worked his way around the flank of the enemy position, using the terrain to cover his approach. He was a master of machine guns, and he knew exactly how to defeat them. He got close enough to use grenades, then directed his men to bring up demolition charges. In a stunning act of bravery, he climbed onto the roof of the blockhouse itself, exposing himself to fire from other positions, to drop explosives through an air vent. The fortification fell silent. A critical artery of the Japanese defense had been severed. The men who had been pinned down could now move forward. A breach had been created. Basilone's actions had broken the stalemate in his sector, but he was not finished. He saw an American tank struggling, trapped in the soft ash and targeted by an enemy mortar crew. He immediately began guiding it out of the trap, directing it toward safer ground where its cannon could be brought to bear on other enemy strongpoints. He was in the open, organizing, leading, completely focused on the next objective. He was moving along the edge of the airfield, his mind already on the next tactical problem, when a mortar shell landed almost at his feet. There was a sudden, violent concussion, a blast of shrapnel that tore through the air. In a single, random, impersonal moment of war, the man who had seemed indestructible was gone. John Basilone, the hero of Guadalcanal, the face of the war bond tour, the husband of less than a year, lay dead on the black sands of Iwo Jima. He had been on the island for less than an hour. His war was over. He would not see the flag raised on Suribachi, nor would he ever return to his wife, Lena. For his actions on that beach, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in the Second World War to receive both that decoration and the Medal of Honor. He had fought his way out of a hero's welcome and back into the heart of the inferno. He had become a legend for surviving the impossible on Guadalcanal. On Iwo Jima, he became immortal for facing it one last time. He had finally made it back to his men, and he died leading them. The raw courage displayed on the battlefield is one thing, a matter of public record, etched into citations and official histories. But what of the man himself, before the uniform, before the medals? Who was John Basilone when the guns were silent? To understand him, you have to go back to Raritan, New Jersey, to a large, boisterous Italian-American family. He was one of 10 children, a boy who grew up in a world where family and community were everything. He was not a natural scholar, and the quiet life of his hometown seemed too small for his ambitions. There was a restlessness in him, a desire for something more. Before he was a Marine, he was a soldier in the United States Army, serving a 3-year tour in the Philippines. It was there he earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, Manila John. He loved the military, the structure, the camaraderie. He even became a champion boxer during his time there. When he returned home, civilian life just did not fit. He worked as a truck driver, but the call of the service was too strong. He tried to re-enlist in the Army, but was told he would have to wait. The Marine Corps, however, was ready for him immediately. It was a fateful decision, one that would place him on a trajectory with history. Those who knew him paint a picture of a man who was surprisingly soft-spoken and humble, a stark contrast to the ferocity he displayed in combat. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. He was a non-commissioned officer to his corps, a sergeant who cared deeply for the welfare of his men. He saw them not as subordinates, but as his responsibility, his brothers. This sense of duty was the bedrock of his character. When he spoke, men listened, not because of his rank, but because of the quiet confidence he exuded. He was a natural leader, but his leadership was born of competence and care, not of ego. The war bond tour must have been a unique kind of torment for a man like Basilone. He was thrust into a world of parades, celebrity handshakes, and scripted speeches. He was no longer a sergeant among his peers. He was a symbol, a living legend asked to sell the war to the people back home. He was profoundly uncomfortable with the adulation. He felt that the real heroes were still out in the Pacific, or buried there. He repeatedly requested to return to the fighting, turning down a commission as an officer and a safe instructor's post in the United States. He felt his place was with the new recruits, training them, and ultimately, leading them into combat. He believed he had a duty to pass on what he had learned, to give the young Marines the best possible chance of survival. It was during this time, in the strange limbo between the hell of Guadalcanal and the inferno of Iwo Jima, that he found a different kind of life. He met Lena Mae Riggi, a sergeant in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. Theirs was a whirlwind romance, a brief period of light in a life defined by shadow and duty. They married in the summer of 1944, just months before he was to ship out for the Pacific one last time. In Lena, he seemed to find a partner who understood the man behind the hero, who saw the quiet strength and the deep-seated sense of obligation that drove him. For a few short months, Manila John was a husband. He had something to come home to, a future that extended beyond the next battle. But the pull of duty was absolute. He had to go back. He had given his word to his men that he would. Legends are born in the crucible of battle, and the stories that surrounded John Basilone on Guadalcanal were almost mythological. How could one man, with just a couple of others, hold off a regimental-sized attack for 2 days? The accounts spoke of him running in the open, under a constant hail of fire, to clear jams in his machine guns and resupply them with ammunition from other positions. They told of him using his bare hands to move the hot barrels of the guns, of fighting on with almost no sleep, fueled by sheer will. Did it all happen exactly as the stories say? In the chaos of combat, memory and myth can become intertwined. What is undeniable is that something extraordinary happened in his sector. An entire Japanese assault was broken, and he was at the very center of it. The speculation about his relentless drive to return to combat is a more complex matter. On the surface, it was about loyalty, a sergeant's promise to his men. But some have wondered if there was something deeper at play. Was he hounded by survivor's guilt? The profound burden of being the one who lived while so many others did not? The War Bond Tour celebrated his survival, But for a man like Basilone, every cheer might have been a painful reminder of the friends he had lost. Perhaps the noise of the crowds and the bright lights of fame were more terrifying to him than the sound of enemy fire. In the field, the rules were simple, the objectives clear. Back home, he was adrift in a world he no longer understood. There is also the question of the warrior's spirit. Could a man who had experienced combat at its most primal level ever truly be content with peace? Some men are forged by war into something that no longer fits the civilian world. It is possible that Basilone felt most alive, most himself, when the stakes were highest. The quiet life he could have had with Lena, the safety of a stateside post, may have felt like a betrayal of his own nature. He was Manila John, the fighter, the leader of men in the most extreme circumstances. Maybe returning to that inferno was not a choice so much as an inevitability, the only way he knew how to be. Even the details of his final moments on Iwo Jima are shrouded in the fog of war. The official account cites a mortar shell, but other reports from men who were nearby have suggested it could have been machine gun fire from a blockhouse he was attacking. Some stories even claim he was still alive for a short time after being hit, trying to give orders to his men. In the end, the exact cause is a footnote to the larger truth. He died as he had lived for the past 3 years, at the front, leading from the front, completely committed to the men by his side. The rumors and speculation do not diminish his legacy. They simply add to the texture of it, reminding us that behind the black and white photographs and the official citations was a complex human being, driven by forces we can only try to understand. The impact of a single life, especially one cut short, is a difficult thing to measure. For the men on Red Beach 2 on Iwo Jima, John Basilone's presence, however brief, was a force of nature. In the critical opening hours of that invasion, when everything was chaos and the advance had stalled under withering fire, he was the anchor. His decision to bypass the heavily fortified blockhouse, to flank it and destroy it with demolitions and grenades, broke a key point of resistance. It was a tactical choice made in a hurricane of violence, a choice that almost certainly saved the lives of the men pinned down around him. Did his actions single-handedly secure the beachhead? That would be an oversimplification. But they created a crack in the Japanese defenses, a moment of opportunity that other Marines could exploit. In those crucial moments, he was not a legend or a war hero on a poster. He was a gunnery sergeant doing his job, and in doing so, he changed the immediate course of the battle for his sector. Beyond the black sands of that island, his story took on a different life. He became a permanent fixture in the institutional memory of the United States Marine Corps. He was the only enlisted Marine in the war to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. This fact alone set him apart. But his legacy became something more than a collection of medals. He came to embody the ideal of the non-commissioned officer, the leader who does not send his men into danger, but leads them there. His rejection of a safe commission, his insistence on returning to the infantry, became a foundational story. A parable of selfless leadership passed down from drill instructors to new recruits for generations. It is a story that speaks to the core of the Marine identity, a belief that honor is not found in fame or safety, but in standing with your comrades in the most difficult places on Earth. This transformation from man to symbol is visible in the world around us, if you know where to look. More than one United States Navy destroyer has carried the name USS Basilone, a rare and profound honor for an enlisted man. These are not museum pieces, they are active warships, projecting power across the globe, carrying his name into the 21st century. A parade is held in his hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, every year. Streets and bridges bear his name. He has become part of the American civic landscape. One has to wonder what the quiet, unassuming man who felt so out of place on a war bond tour would make of it all. Would he recognize the hero celebrated in these ceremonies? Or would he see a story that has grown far beyond the simple, powerful motivations of a man who just wanted to be with his platoon? In recent years, his story reached a new, global audience. The television series The Pacific brought his journey from the Philippines to Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima into the homes of millions. It put a face and a voice to the black and white photographs, attempting to capture the man behind the medals. This portrayal has arguably done more to shape his modern legacy than any official citation. It presents the conflict within him, the tension between his public persona as a hero and his private desire to be just a sergeant among his men. But it also raises a subtle question. When a life is dramatized, does it bring us closer to the truth of that person? Or does it create a new kind of myth, one tailored for a modern audience? The John Basilone we see on screen is a compelling character, but the real man, driven by a sense of duty we can now barely comprehend, remains a figure of profound and enduring mystery. His ultimate impact, perhaps, is not just in what he did, but in the questions his life forces us to ask about the nature of courage, duty, and the immense weight of a promise. The decision to turn down a commission, to refuse a safe posting as an instructor in the United States, is a key that might unlock the puzzle of John Basilone. It was a choice that seems to defy logic. The Marine Corps command structure, the very institution to which he had dedicated his life, was offering him its highest compliment. They were not just decorating him, they were inviting him into the officer class, giving him a path away from the front lines. To refuse was not an act of insubordination, but it was a profound statement. It suggests his relationship with command was complex. He respected the rank. He followed the orders, but his ultimate allegiance was not to the hierarchy itself. It was to the men at the bottom of it. One has to wonder about the conversations that took place, the officers who tried to persuade him to take the safe route, and his quiet, unshakable insistence that his place was elsewhere. He was telling them, in his own way, that their definition of honor and his were not quite the same. This sense of duty, which superseded even self-preservation, was recognized by the men who led him. His actions at Guadalcanal unfolded under the command of legends like Lieutenant Colonel Chesty Puller. In the world of the Marine Corps, there was no higher judge of a man's character. For a man like Puller, who saw combat as the ultimate crucible, Basilone's performance was not just a heroic anomaly, it was the epitome of what an enlisted leader should be. The respect was not one-sided. Basilone had served under General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines before the war, and he understood the world of military authority. Yet, his most meaningful relationships seem to have been horizontal, with his peers, and downward, with the young Marines he trained and led. He was the vital link in the chain of command, the one who had to translate an officer's strategic plan into the brutal, intimate reality of a firefight. He did not just command respect, he inspired a fierce, personal loyalty, a trust that he would be there when it mattered most. That trust was tested in a very different arena during the war bond tour. Here, the command structure was not made of generals, but of public relations officers, politicians, and Hollywood producers. He was no longer a sergeant, he was a commodity, a symbol to be paraded before cheering crowds. His quiet discomfort in this role is well documented. He was a man of action, not of words. and he was being asked to sell a sanitized version of the war he had just survived. This experience must have created a strange dissonance. He was being celebrated by the highest authorities in the land, yet he felt profoundly out of place. His desire to return to the fighting can be seen as a rejection of this new, alien form of command. He was choosing the brutal, honest authority of the battlefield over the hollow, performative authority of the home front. It was a choice to return to a world where a man's worth was measured not by the applause he received, but by the trust he earned from the men to his left and his right. The creation of a hero's image often begins with a single defining document. For John Basilone, that document was his Medal of Honor citation. It is a piece of powerful declarative prose, describing a desperate, chaotic defense in clear, heroic terms. It speaks of his initiative, his courage under fire, his relentless ferocity, and it is all true. But a citation, by its very nature, is a simplification. It has to be. It cannot capture the exhaustion, the terror, the smell of cordite and death, the deafening noise that reduces the world to a few square yards of mud and sand. The official narrative, the first draft of the myth, sands away the grit of reality to reveal the gleaming story underneath. This is not a deception, it is a necessity of storytelling, of creating a symbol that can inspire a nation. The man who lived through those hours on Guadalcanal and the hero described in the citation became two distinct entities, forever linked, but never quite the same. This symbolic version of Basilone was then put on public display. The war bond tour solidified his cultural image as the ideal American fighting man. He was handsome, humble, the son of Italian immigrants who had proven his loyalty to his adopted country in the most profound way possible. He was the perfect face for a nation at war, a testament to the idea that anyone, from any background, could rise to greatness through valor. But this public image was a curated one. It emphasized his modesty and his quiet strength, but it left little room for the complexities of the man himself. What were his politics, his doubts, his private fears? These things were irrelevant to the myth. The cultural image of John Basilone was not really about him at all. It was about what America needed to believe about itself in 1943. He was a mirror, reflecting the nation's most cherished virtues back at itself. After his death, the myth was no longer constrained by the presence of the man. It was free to grow, to become a permanent part of the American story. He became a fixture, not just in military history, but in a kind of civic folklore. The naming of warships, the annual parades, the statues, these are all acts of remembrance, but they are also acts of myth-making. They transform a mortal man into an archetype, a patron saint of enlisted leadership and selfless sacrifice. Each new generation of Marines learns his story, not just as a historical account, but as a moral lesson. Yet there is a quiet paradox in all of this. The more he is celebrated as a symbol, the harder it becomes to see the man. The cultural image, in its power and its persistence, can create a distance, turning a living, breathing person into a revered but remote figure, frozen in time. The myth ensures he is never forgotten, but it may also prevent him from ever being fully known. The story we remember often begins on Guadalcanal, but John Basilone's journey as a professional soldier started years earlier in a different uniform. Before he was a Marine, he was a soldier in the United States Army, serving a full 3-year tour in the Philippines. This was the old, pre-war army, a small professional force stationed in a colonial outpost. It was a world away from the citizen soldier force that would fight the Second World War. What did he learn there, in the heat and humidity of Manila, during a time of relative peace? He learned the fundamentals of soldiering, the discipline, the care of a weapon, the rhythm of garrison life. This experience sets him apart. When he enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1940, he was not a fresh-faced kid from New Jersey. He was a veteran, a man who had already seen a bit of the world and understood the demands of military life. It begs a question, though. Why, after completing his service and returning home, did he feel the pull to go back, and this time, to choose the tougher path of the Marines? Was it simply a lack of civilian opportunities? Or had he found something in that structured life that he couldn't find anywhere else? On Guadalcanal, his famous stand was not an isolated event. It was the climax of weeks of relentless, grinding attrition. His role as a machine gun section leader was one of immense responsibility but little glory. His daily reality would have been a grueling routine of improving defensive positions, clearing fields of fire, and the constant nerve-wracking maintenance of his water-cooled Browning machine guns. These were complex, heavy weapons, prone to jamming if not meticulously cared for, especially in the mud and tropical damp. The citation speaks of him running a gun himself, but his primary job was to direct the fire of his entire section, to keep his men supplied, to replace casualties, and to make life or death decisions about where to concentrate their firepower. He was a technician of combat, a master of his craft, long before he became a hero. The 36-hour battle was the ultimate test of skills honed through endless, unglamorous repetition in the jungle. It was the work, not just the moment, that defined him. When he was pulled from the Pacific for the War Bond tour, his return to the fight was not immediate. He was assigned to Camp Pendleton in California, a sprawling training base churning out new Marines for the war. He could have settled into a comfortable role, a living legend used to inspire recruits from a safe distance. Instead, he actively resisted it. He insisted on being an instructor, on getting his hands dirty, on passing along the brutal lessons he had learned. Think of the men he trained. They were young, barely out of their teens, and they were looking at a man who had done the impossible and survived. What did they see in his eyes? Did he teach them the textbook maneuvers? Or did he teach them the unwritten rules of survival he had learned in the dark on Guadalcanal? This period is a crucial, often overlooked chapter. He was not just a symbol, he was a mentor, shaping the next wave of men who would face the same horrors he had. His desperation to get back to the front lines wasn't just about his own sense of duty. Perhaps it was also about a profound responsibility he felt for the men he was training. A need to lead them personally rather than sending them off from the safety of a California base. His final actions on Iwo Jima are often portrayed as a singular, heroic charge. But the tactical situation on Red Beach 2 that morning was one of complete and utter chaos. The initial waves of Marines were pinned down, unable to move off the volcanic sand. They were caught in a perfectly designed killing zone, taking fire from a network of concealed blockhouses and pillboxes built into the high ground. The advance had completely stalled. Basilone's unit was trapped. His decision to move out and attack the nearest blockhouse was not a reckless act of bravado. It was a calculated tactical necessity. He was a gunnery sergeant, an experienced non-commissioned officer, and he recognized that if someone didn't break the stalemate, his men would be annihilated where they lay. He was using his experience to solve a tactical problem. He maneuvered his machine gun team to a flank, directed their fire to suppress the enemy, and then led the assault that knocked it out. It was a textbook example of fire and movement, executed under the most extreme pressure imaginable. His death came moments later, while trying to get his men off that beach and toward the next objective. It was the final, tragic act of a leader who, until the very end, was focused not on glory, but on the grim, practical work of keeping his men alive and moving forward.